city is burning! Help! Help!
London, 1666, one of Europe's largest cities, a hub of trade, politics, and terrible food. A city through which ships from all over the world pass. And a city built almost entirely of wood. But one day, this city will literally go up in flames from one end to the other. In just a single day, most of London will vanish from the map. Over 13,000 houses, dozens of churches, and nearly all the streets will burn to the ground. And those who don't manage to get out in time will surely be doomed. Today, using archives, historical sources, and AI-based reconstructions, we will literally recreate these terrible events. How the city burned block by block, why the authorities could have stopped the fire but did not, and how thousands of people tried to survive amidst the flames. And all of this happened because of a single bun. September 2nd, 1666 looks like any ordinary day in London. The city sleeps, though the word sleeps is rather relative for 17th century London. Here, someone is always working, someone is drinking, someone is arguing, and someone is trying to quietly slip away with someone else's wallet. Everything is just like today, except that back then, London was still a Christian city. On one of the narrow streets in the Paddington Lane area stands an ordinary house with a bakery on the ground floor. Its owner is Thomas Fariner. He works as a baker at the Royal Court, so business is going well for him. At night, as always, he finishes work, extinguishes the oven, and goes to sleep, or so he thinks. Some embers remain in the oven. This is nothing unusual for a bakery. In the 17th century, most fires in cities started this way. Around 2 in the morning, flames are already creeping up the wooden beams of the house. Walls, ceilings, stairs, everything is dry, old, and ready to catch fire. Within minutes, the fire breaks out through the windows and the roof. If you're now wondering how we know all this, and whether AI is making up all this nonsense, the answer is no. This is described in the accounts of people who were there that night. The most famous source is the diary of the English official Samuel Pepys, who woke up to news of the fire and recorded in detail how it spread through the city. Later, historians cross-referenced these entries with official reports, eyewitness letters, and city documents, which is why we know quite precisely how this story began. So let's return to the moment when residents of neighbouring houses near Fariner's bakery begin to wake up to the smell of smoke. In theory, the story could have ended there. London already had a fairly simple firefighting system. If a house caught fire, several neighbouring buildings around it were simply demolished to create an open space. The fire had nowhere to spread, and the blaze was stopped. The problem is that this requires the mayor's permission. The mayor of London is Thomas Bloodworth, and when he was woken up in the middle of the night and informed of the fire, according to eyewitnesses, Bloodworth looked at the flames and said that the fire was so small that even a woman could put it out. After making this sexist remark, he went straight back to sleep. This decision would turn out to be the worst administrative decision in history. And while the mayor slept, the wind began to do its work. London at that time was the perfect place for a large and deadly fire to spread. The houses stood almost right up against one another. Many of them had upper floors that jutted out over the street. In some places, you could simply step from one roof to another. When the wind picked up the sparks, within just a few hours it was no longer a single house burning, but dozens. And by dawn, the fire had engulfed an entire neighborhood near the Thames. The flames rise above the rooftops, and the smoke is visible from the other side of the Thames. The fire is already moving along Pudding's Lane toward the warehouses standing right by the river. These warehouses belong to merchants who store goods from all over the world here, and very soon the fire will reach these barrels of wine and oil. And there was gunpowder there as well. At this moment, people begin to wake up en masse and pour into the streets. At first, most simply watch the fire as a strange spectacle. But within a few minutes, it becomes clear that the fire is moving too quickly. The wind that night is blowing from the river and literally driving the flames deeper into the city. In Samuel Pepys's diary, there is an entry about how he woke up early in the morning to the sound of people talking about the fire. At first, he didn't think much of it, but when he climbed onto the roof of his house and looked toward the city, he saw a huge strip of fire moving along the waterfront. By this point, the fire was already out of control. People began carrying their belongings out of their homes. First, money, documents, and jewelry. Then furniture, chests, clothing, and even doors off their hinges. In the 17th century, most of a person's possessions were literally kept in their room. So, when a house caught fire, people tried to save whatever they could carry out. The streets quickly fill with carts, horses, wagons, people with sacks on their backs, children dragging bundles of clothes. All of this begins to move toward the Thames, as the river seems to be the safest place in the city. And indeed, within a few hours, the Thames looks like a huge floating warehouse. Barges and boats are filled with furniture, goods, and even entire shop counters. Some merchants manage to load their goods onto ships to save at least part of their business, and some even find a moment to engage in trade. By midday, a vast part of the city near the river is already ablaze. The flames rise so high that they can be seen for many kilometers. On the other side of the English Channel, looking at the huge columns of smoke over London, people begin to think that the Vikings have attacked England again. Therefore, France immediately surrenders. At this point, the authorities finally begin to grasp the scale of the problem. People suggest what should have been done 10 hours earlier to start tearing down houses ahead of the fire. But now, it is much harder to do so. The streets are packed with people and carts, and the fire has already spread so far that entire neighborhoods would have to be demolished. The temperature rises so high that the lead on some rooftops begins to melt. And this is no metaphor. Chronicles of the time describe how molten metal flowed down the gutters and dripped directly onto the cobblestones, and perhaps even onto people. But here are these two gentlemen, right in the thick of it, sipping their morning tea, discussing not the weather, but who is behind this arson. Perhaps not exactly like that. But it is a fact that right in the midst of the fire, rumors were circulating throughout the city about who exactly had started it. London had just gone through a war with Holland. So many people immediately concluded that the fire was an act of sabotage. Talk began about foreign agents, the French and the Dutch, who were supposedly roaming the city and setting houses on fire. A few random people were even caught right on the street and interrogated as authorities tried to figure out who had sent them. All of this, of course, had nothing to do with the actual cause of the fire. But in a city that had been burning for half a day, people needed some kind of explanation for what was happening. Meanwhile, the fire continues to move westward, toward the most densely populated part of London. This area is home to workshops, warehouses, taverns, and hundreds of residential buildings. Samuel Pepys writes in his diary that he saw some residents literally burying their money and valuables in the ground because they couldn't take them with them. Pepys himself, by the way, also decided to play it safe and buried his valuable possessions in the garden, including wine and cheese. By the third day, such a large part of the city is already burning that the fire is visible from dozens of kilometers away. Smoke rises high above London and covers everything around it with a thick, dark cloud. People who just yesterday thought they would have time to return for the rest of their belongings now watch as their homes disappear, along with the streets. By this point, the fire had already reached the very heart of the city. And next, it engulfed one of the few buildings Londoners considered nearly untouchable. The old St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a massive stone building. That is precisely why thousands of people had brought their belongings there in the preceding hours. Merchants had stacked fabrics, books, papers, and valuable goods. The stone walls seemed more reliable than any house in the city. The problem was that wooden scaffolding surrounded the cathedral. The building was undergoing repairs at the time. The flames rose up the scaffolding and spread to the roof. The cathedral, which people considered the safest place in the city, turned into a massive furnace. Along with it, thousands of books and documents that people had tried to save there were burned. Meanwhile, in the residential neighborhoods where there were still some people, the fire climbed the stairwells, and within minutes the upper floors were already filled with thick smoke. People who woke up too late simply had nowhere to go. Post-fire reports mention rooms where charred beds were found near the windows. People tried to breathe fresh air, but the smoke filled the house faster than they could do anything. Some tried to escape across the rooftops. In old London, houses stood so close together that sometimes you could walk over to a neighbour's. But when the beams were burning beneath your feet and thick smoke surrounded you, this often ended with a fall right onto the street. Officially, authorities later recorded only 6 deaths, but modern historians view this figure with skepticism. In the 17th century, no one kept accurate records of the city's poor residents. If a person disappeared along with their house, it was often simply not recorded anywhere. Only after the fire destroyed the central districts did the authorities finally begin to act. King Charles II of England personally ordered houses to be demolished ahead of the fire. The neighborhoods were blown up with gunpowder, creating wide, empty strips, and it was precisely these gaps in the buildings that gradually stopped the flames. A few days later, the fire finally died out. 13,000 houses and 87 churches were burned down. The authorities began searching for those responsible, and obviously the blame did not lie with the authorities themselves, who had failed to respond in time to a small fire in a bakery, but with ordinary people. Baker Thomas Fariner was interrogated, but the court was unable to prove that the fire had started specifically because of his negligence. Instead, the authorities quickly found another culprit, the French clockmaker Robert Hubert. He confessed to allegedly setting the city on fire, but the problem was that he wasn't even in London when the fire started. They hanged him anyway, and London itself began to look completely different after the fire. When the city had to be rebuilt, most of the new buildings were already made of brick and stone. Why is that?